Goedemorgen, dames en heren. We zoeken met de meest geavanceerde instrumenten naar leven in het heelal. Maar eigenlijk weten we niet eens waar we naar op zoek zijn.
First question is, what is life?
Niet als je naar de definitie van leven kijkt.
With the most advanced instruments, we are looking for life in the universe, but we don't even know what we are looking for. That is, not if you look at the definition of life, since there is no such thing as the definition of life.
Het wel een helder beeld is van wat leven precies is. Als we kijken naar wat de
It is about Wikipedia, where life is a quality of organisms. But with this, as much is said as that life is a quality of life, which is a circular argument. Quality also means to say that there must be something that causes life first, something that has to have life as a quality. In short, the common definition is life is a chemical system which is capable to sustain itself, to grow and to reproduce by metabolism. So in this materialistic vision, it is about a chemical system, about lifeless matter, that suddenly comes to life in a certain composition. How and at what moment this life arises remains a mystery, but the idea is that it results from matter in any case. In general, the cell is considered to be the smallest building block of life in this vision. All life is made up of cells, is the thought. However, it becomes interesting when we take a look inside that cell. Because with amazement, scientists discover that the cell is a world of life in itself. With current technology, we are capable of studying the processes taking place in it down to the smallest detail. These processes turn out to be so complex and structured that a comparison with a city is often made. Each cell could be thought of as a complete functioning community with its own power plants, plants where building blocks are produced and packed, and transport systems by which those building blocks are then transported to exactly the right place. There are copy machines, there's waste disposal. In short, a world of continuous focused action by molecules and proteins, where all is in tune. To give an impression of what happens in a cell, I would like to show you two animations made by scientists. They are animated because this all takes place at such a minuscule scale that the actual processes cannot be filmed. So by the animations they made it visually comprehensible. On the left we see an example of those copy machines. Here our DNA, our hereditary material, is copied, which has to be done before it can be turned into building blocks. And on the right, we see the piece of highway in the cell, the transport of those building blocks. It may look like science fiction, but those molecular machines, those proteins, turn out to literally move in that way, step by step. And it's amusing to realize that this is happening in billions of our cells at this exact moment. Now the big question is, what is it that directs all processes of the so-called lifeless molecules? If life is a quality of organisms, with the cell being the smallest unity of it, like science puts it nowadays, then what is it that takes place inside that cell? What is it that puts in motion all that autonomous movement?
Someone who can help us in answering this question and who we would like to quote in this context is Plato. From ancient wisdom, Plato gives a simple but clear and universal answer to the question what life is. Life, so he says, is the capacity to come in motion and to react. So, the capacity to cause action and reaction. And that is exactly what we see happening in that cell. The movement of all those microscopic small parts that react on one another in their complex cooperation.
In beweging komen van al die microscopisch kleine onderdelen die in hun complexe samenwerking dus op elkaar reageren.
Now let's see where this definition also applies, since not only inside the cell, but also between cells there is continuous movement. Continuously, exchange of information is taking place, where, depending on the signal, an appropriate reaction occurs. For example, in case of unwanted visitors, the immune system comes into action and white blood cells literally chase the intruders. Turning to a somewhat larger scale, we see that organs also execute their specific tasks for which they mutually coordinate and cooperate. Yet a step further, with humans and animals, the capacity to act and react is entirely clear. And in the plant kingdom, we see, besides growth, which is motion as well, also the capacity to react on the environment. Trees can warn each other with semiogamicals when they are eaten away by insects. And recently the spectacular discovery was made that complete forests exchange information and nutrients via root systems. For instance, healthy trees actively pump water to their congeners that are having a hard time and would otherwise dehydrate. Taking it a step further again, we see that also Earth and other planets in our solar system comply with Plato's definition. We see planets rotating on their axis, and together they also rotate around the Sun. And in its turn, our solar system turns out to rotate as a whole around a still larger center. And here on this cosmic scale as well, continuous interaction takes place. For instance, think of the tidal effect by the moon and all water life that depends on it. Or Jupiter, who causes increased solar activity with its 12-year cycle. If we take a look at the other extreme on a micro level, then there is no difference. Comparable to a solar system, atoms consist of rotating parts around a core. And in quantum physics, the mysterious phenomenon was discovered that atoms react to one another simultaneously over large distances. A more clear example of interaction of molecules in chemical reactions can hardly be found, I would say. It is quite a listing. However, what we want to make clear is that we can draw a fundamental conclusion from this. Wherever we look and on whatever scale, everything moves. Everything acts and reacts on one another. Try to think of something that knows no movement, however slow it may appear to our eyes. When you think about this, it cannot but raise wonderment about where that movement comes from. And that wonderment is crucial in order to make progress on the answer on the question what life is. Because why do we limit ourselves by saying that life needs to consist of cells? Or by saying that there can only be life when elements like carbon and hydrogen are present? Why don't we transcend this limitation we imposed on ourselves and look at what sets all that movement on smaller and larger scale in motion?
Again, Plato can help us, because in his description of life he introduces another term, self-movement. And on this he says the following. Something that is set in motion from outside is always temporary and impermanent. However, self-movement, that what causes movement from inside, has to be timeless. Self-movement does not have a starting or an ending point, since if it would be finite, it would never be able to act as a source for that movement. Now, when we summarize this, based on Plato, we arrive at the following. First, everything moves and reacts to one another, so everything is life. Second, life or movement comes from within and is timeless. So, life is infinite self-movement. It is therefore not a quality of organisms, as Wikipedia puts it, but the origin, the essence of it. It is the self of everything that comes into movement from within. In Theosophia, this is called the spiritual principle. The idea that everything we perceive, each appearance, is the expression of an inner force which works behind or through it. But where does this force, this self that comes into movement, come from? In order to get a good notion of this, we must try to develop a view of that infinite source Plato is talking about. Infinite means boundless, and this means that you cannot add to it or take from it, otherwise it would not be boundless. It also means that there must be the boundless, because otherwise there would be something outside it, and there is no outside the boundless. And it means that in essence, the self of the one also is the self of the other. Everything is the expression of the one boundless life. Quite a stream of thought, but you could imagine this as an endless, motionless ocean that encompasses everything. As soon as motion arises in it, waves and currents appear, which we consider to be independent things. We perceive things as separate, which are limited expression of the one universal life.
Wij als afzonderlijk waarnemen is slechts een beperkte uitdrukking van het ene universele leven, die oneindige oceaan.
Motionless as infinite boundlessness, but eternally in motion in all its parts. And that is an important thought. It is not the case that all individual life together constitutes a unity, but rather that everything is that unity, and it is expressing it in individual ways. Of course, every comparison eventually fails, but an analogy to help to get the picture is that of a tree. All parts of the tree, the roots, the trunk, the branches, the leaves, can be recognized as separate parts. They all express a part of that tree, but in fact, they are that tree. It is the one life that is flowing through all those parts. In the same way, the boundless flows through every being, and each being expresses its own unique aspect of it. From atoms to universes, it is all the same life, from which we only perceive a limited expression. The physical focal point on the outer plane, so to speak. We see only the outer shell, the tip of the endless proverbial iceberg. Just like we cannot see electricity as a principle, but we do perceive all kinds of electrical activity. Another term for life is consciousness. As soon as there is movement in that ocean, there is conscious being. Literally, being that is conscious. Being that starts to move, that perceives in one way or another, and through that, it is able to act and react, as Plato defines it. So consciousness or life is boundless, eternal motion. We can, however, recognize patterns in it. For life generates a number of natural laws, and cyclicity is one of them. If we stick to the example of the ocean, we observe that there is a rhythm in the motion. There is an endless rising and disappearing of waves in that ocean. It is a property of life to have alternating periods of activity and of rest, different states of consciousness, consciousness can be in. What to us is appearing and disappearing is nothing but a shift of consciousness to another plane of activity. It is a dynamical process in which consciousness periodically withdraws from the outer to the inner plane to, after a period of rest, come to the front again.
Therefore, life and death are merely phases of life, and what we call death is nothing but another state of life. So this means there is continuity of life, and there are only relative endings and beginnings. The outer appearance, that is to say the body, disappears, but the consciousness that caused it isn't gone. The wave as an appearance disappears, but the essence lives on as an inseparable part of that ocean. But how do those waves come about? What makes everything awake again after a period of rest? Like, for instance, in spring, when nature comes to life and everything starts to grow and blossom again. Here we arrive at the second law that we can recognize in life. which is the impulse to grow. It's the inner urge in every being to express more and more of that infinity. It is the same impulse that makes us wake up each morning, ready for new experiences and new things to learn. It is what expresses itself in animals as survival instinct and what is contained in a seed to develop an enormous tree. The force of this urge is easily demonstrated by a phenomenon everybody knows, of asphalt cracked by a seedling which grows straight through it from the dark. Another word for this urge, this law, is evolution. Evolution in its true meaning of developing ever more of the boundlessness that all life in its essence is. And because there is no beginning and no end in the boundless, we can also understand that it is expressed in an infinite number of forms. This development, this growth, also means that in the cyclical process, nothing returns to exactly the same level, but always moves a step higher, in fact, like a spiral. Nothing stays the same, but as an expression of the one, everything is equally valuable. Depending on how far a consciousness has evolved, has developed its potential from inside out, it now has reached a certain level of development. The mineral kingdom or the plant kingdom each brings about its own specific stage of development.
Mineraalrijk, planten of dierenrijk, ieder brengt zijn eigen karakteristieke stadium van ontwikkeling.
And within these kingdoms, each individual consciousness does so in its own way. But those kingdoms of nature are not separated from each other. They cannot even exist without each other. Ecologists know as no other that in ecosystems everything is interconnected and every part has a function in the totality. This cooperation in nature is necessary, and besides cyclicity and evolution, this constitutes a third law of life. Life can only exist thanks to other life. Just like we depend on our planet, the cells in our body depend on us, and without our cells we could not have our bodies. It's an interdependence in which the further developed consciousnesses offers the less developed consciousness the possibility to manifest itself. And at the same time, this lesser developed consciousness constitutes the necessary vehicle for that higher consciousness. Another word for this cooperation is emanation, which literally means flowing out. It is the flowing out of an atmosphere of higher developed life in which lesser developed life can have its existence. So there is no creation out of nothing, but an attraction of what is already there in essence. Emanation is the law of life within life, in which the further developed, encompassing consciousness lays down the pattern that is automatically followed by the lower. This principle also explains why we encounter universal patterns in nature, like the golden ratio, which we recognize in all realms of nature. From the shape of shells and the distribution of the petals of a flower to the proportions in our body, we see this cosmic ratio reflected everywhere in the life that is part of it.
Another interesting phenomenon that we can clarify by emanation is the fact that individual parts cannot explain the behavior of the greater whole they are part of. If we observe a beehive, for example, or an anthill acting as a perfect unity, we cannot explain this from the individual bees and ants, or the rhythmic beating of the heart, which cannot be explained from the individual heart cells. It is always the lesser developed consciousness, those individual elements, that automatically follow the pattern of the higher consciousness. As above, so below, exactly in the way our organs automatically fulfill their duties within our consciousness. We see cells that specialize within the sphere of influence of those organs. And in this way, we arrive again at the processes we started out with. Those countless molecules and proteins that in their turn perform their tasks within the sphere of influence of the cell, as a minuscule link in the endless series of life within life on its way to express ever more of the boundless. The most important things in order for you. According to the definition of Plato, life or consciousness is the ability to act and react. Everything moves, so everything is life. All those individual consciousnesses are expressions of the one boundless, that endless ocean we talked about. We also have seen that life has its natural laws, of which the first is cyclicity, alternating periods of activity and rest, in which life and death are just different states of consciousness. Then evolution, that inner urge of all life to develop ever more of its endless latent powers. And lastly, emanation or life within life, the infinite cooperation in which no single link or part can be left out. Thank you, Bouke.